We know that in the fantasy playoffs, you want to get every part of your lineup right to make sure you win in advance. That includes team defense and special teams. We always advocate for streaming defenses, playing the matchups. So that leads to the obvious question: which defenses should you stream throughout the playoffs? And is there any defense you can just set and forget? So here we go. Ask and you shall receive. I'm going to break down the top 12 defenses for the fantasy playoffs from week 15 through 17. Now, before we get into the rankings, a couple of notes here. First of all, it goes without saying that there is no standard scoring format for defensive scoring in fantasy because every league plays a little bit different. I'm basing this, a lot of the stats I'm going to use, off of Yahoo Public League's standard scoring. That means 1 point per sack, 2 for interception or fumble recovery, 2 for a safety, a touchdown is 6. And then as far as points against, it's where it gets a little tricky, but basing on what I'm using, if defense happens to hold a team to 6 points or less, that's a 7-point bonus. 7 to 13 points, it's 4 points, then it gets to 1, and all the way down. So if they give up more than 28, you can actually lose points. Again, every league is different. Check your league settings because sometimes, you might get 3 or even more for a turnover. That obviously matters. I've seen leagues that have 2 points per sack. So just check your league settings to know what the deal is. That said, the number one defense I think you should target if possible, or just keep rolling with for the fantasy playoffs, is the team that is first in scoring. In that format, it's the Minnesota Vikings. Now, this was a tough call. There is no obvious defense here that has been dominant. You do have to play matchups, and especially this year, some of the better defenses that I'll get to later have terrible schedules down the stretch, and I still would recommend streaming if possible. But if there's a defense that you can just keep and not have to think about this during your playoffs, it's going to be the Vikings. Brian Flores has done great things with this defense, throwing different looks at quarterbacks and confusing them. That's why this team ranks 4th in sacks with 40 on the season, and they lead the NFL in interceptions. They're also 5th in points allowed at just 18 per game. As far as the schedule, well, first up is the Bears, which they did play just a couple weeks ago, and Caleb Williams did put up a nice game against them. It's really hard to figure which version of Caleb Williams will show up any given week, so it's not a gimme that they put up points for fantasy purposes in week 15. But at the same time, Williams does get sacked a lot and can turn the ball over. Week 16, it's the Seahawks. It's kind of a mediocre matchup there. In week 17, the Packers. This is not a great schedule, but this is probably the best defense out there, again, for all the reasons I already listed. So don't overthink it here. Don't go with a much lesser defense who isn't getting as many sacks and all that. Just go with the Vikings and you'll be fine. At number 2, a defense that was flat out dominant the first half of the season. The LA Chargers have backtracked a little bit, but they are still very good and they do not give up big games to offenses. That's why they're still number 1 in terms of points allowed per game, only barely 16 points a game for their opponents. And this defense is also 5th in both sacks and interceptions on the season. Notice I'm not talking about fumbles because those are really hard to predict, and we're not going to take that too much into account when ranking defenses. Sacks are a little more consistent, and to some extent, I think interceptions, because that comes as a result of pressure on the quarterback. The Chargers schedule statistically is just okay, kind of in the middle for the rest of the season. Look, this week it's the Buccaneers. Baker Mayfield has been good, so again, you'll get some points from them, but don't expect a lot. But it's not something that I feel like you need to pivot to because week 16, it's going to be the Broncos. Very similar, just kind of a mediocre matchup. Week 17 is the Patriots. That's definitely a much better matchup. Number 3, you might not even believe it, I'm going to put the Baltimore Ravens defense here. Yeah, we remember early in the season, this Ravens defense, we were just saying go out and stream against them because they were giving so many points to quarterbacks and wide receivers. But that has definitely changed. Ever since that crazy Thursday night game where they gave up 34 points to Cincinnati and Joe Burrow, who is pretty much torching everybody these days, they have settled down, allowing 22 points per game since. And part of that is because they addressed some holes in the secondary. They got Tre'Davious White in a trade. Roquan Smith had been hurt. Looks like he's healthy now. And so you see things are settling down. So while on the season, they're 24th in terms of fantasy points per game scored, and that number is much better in the second half of the season. But also you should notice that they are 2nd in the league in sacks, and that's something that will at least give you, I guess you could call it a floor for a DST. But the main reason I have them ranked this high is because week 15, again, I know we want to look at the whole big picture here, but remember, if you're in the playoffs, if you don't win this week, the next 2 weeks really don't matter. This week they get the Giants, which is basically the best possible matchup you can get. And they get Tommy DeVito and just a horrible Giants offense. In week 16, it's the Steelers. Not too scary there, especially George Pickens has been missing time. This offense will kick some field goals, but they will not give up a lot of points. And then in week 17, it's the Texans. And look, this is not anything to be worried about either. CJ Stroud not putting up big numbers. This Texans offense is okay, but it's not going to sway me against starting the Ravens. Bet number 4, probably the most improved defense from first half of the season to the second, is the Philadelphia Eagles. And on the season, they've improved to the point that the Eagles have given up the second fewest points. They're also top 10 in sacks, and you see the secondary just continuing to improve as rookie Quinion Mitchell and others just get better. The schedule is okay here. Again, they get the Steelers also this week, definitely without George Pickens. Week 16 is the Commanders, which does not sound like a good matchup, and it isn't, because Jaden Daniels has only thrown 6 interceptions on the season, but he will take sacks. He's got 29 on the season, 29 sacks taken. And then I will say week 17, actually not the cupcake you would think. Sure, the Dallas Cowboys are not winning, and they're not a good team overall, but really it's not Cooper Rush's fault. He's been good. He's limited turnovers as well. He's only thrown 2 picks and taken 10 sacks in his 6 starts. But at the same time, are the Cowboys in week 17 really going to put up a lot of points against the Eagles? I don't think so. Hey, 4 down, several more to go. First, let me remind you, while you're making your waiver claims, setting your lineups for fantasy, don't forget to put your picks on an underdog. And if you haven't tried an underdog yet, keep in mind, you get a free pick just for signing up. This week, it's Jordan Love just getting 1 yard in week 15. Take the higher on 0.5 total yards. You get this if you sign up as a new customer using code ENDGAME. And they also give you a deposit match of 50%, which means you can get all the way up to $1,000 of bonus cash along with the free pick. Just make sure you use code ENDGAME at checkout. Now, number 5, this is a tricky one as well, but again, let's look big picture here. You might not want to start the Buffalo Bills defense this week, but you definitely want to start them in week 16 and 17. So, again, this is where stream if possible. I don't love the idea of rostering a second backup defense, but if you have the space, then sure, maybe go with somebody else this week, because the Lions, they are one of the best offenses in the league. The Bills, it might not get any fantasy points. Just honestly, I'm going to tell you that. But week 16 and 17, it's the Patriots, it's the Jets, and I will say this. If your league happens to play all the way to the end, unfortunately, some leagues do that, all the way to week 18, the Bills would be higher on this list because they get the Patriots again. That's right, Patriots, Jets, Patriots. That is as good as you can get. Unfortunately, that doesn't start until the final 3 weeks. So week 15, the Lions, if they can get maybe a turnover or 2 and not just completely get lit up like they did by the Rams last week, you can get by with the Bills. And at number 6, now it's time to talk about the defense that is tops in the NFL in sacks, the Denver Broncos. So the Broncos have been really good, especially early in the season. Stumbled a little bit, especially right before the bye. They let Jameis Winston light them up, but that hasn't stopped them from still being the league leaders in sacks. They also get a bunch of turnovers as well, including in that game. And the schedule is pretty nice here. They get the Colts, the Chargers, and the Bengals. Well, okay, it was nice until week 17, and you got the Bengals with Joe Burrow, who's the hottest quarterback in the NFL. So this is why Denver can't be higher despite what they've done defensively. And this is why schedule matters so much, because if you look at the fact that Broncos are number 2 in terms of fantasy scoring, but the matchup is going to play such a huge role here. Week 17, really don't want to have to play the Broncos defense. But again, if you have to pick one, those first 5 aren't available. You're still good enough for the Broncos because these next 2 weeks, they could carry you at least into the championship. Now, at number 7, let's put the Kansas City Chiefs. This was looking like one of the best defenses in the league for the first few games, but they've kind of reverted back a little bit. They've allowed some big passing games to quarterbacks. They're not forcing quite as many turnovers, but they are still solid. And statistically, really not that impressive. They're 26th in the league in sacks, just kind of middle of the road in terms of turnovers forced. But their schedule is good enough that we can keep them at least in the top 10 here. Week 15 is the Cleveland Browns. Winston should be good for at least a turnover or 2, if not a pick 6. The Texans, week 16, that matchup isn't as bad as it looked early in the season. And then the Steelers in week 17. So they are, let's say, good enough. You've been wondering where the Steelers defense is? Here we go. Number 8, and probably they should be lower, honestly, based on the fact that they have statistically the hardest schedule remaining. That's not just me saying this. Mike Clay of ESPN, very smart guy who always projects not only future strength of schedule, but also compares it to the past. Yeah, the Steelers' remaining schedule is the hardest of all DSTs for fantasy. Just listen to this. Eagles, Ravens, Chiefs. Yeah, they get to face Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, and Pat Mahomes over the next 3 weeks. I don't know what the Steelers did to the schedule makers, but this is as hard as you can get. It's not going to go well for the DST. So while we view the Steelers defense as one of the best, really for a while, an elite defense all season, you just can't ignore what they're going up against here. So I can't say they're just not an option at all, but man, they are definitely not one of the best. On the other hand, number 9, let's put the Green Bay Packers. They have the 4th best remaining strength of schedule. This week it's the Seahawks. Next week it's the Saints, and that's the one that's really appealing. And then week 17, it's a little tricky. You see the Vikings on there, and you think that's not a great matchup here. And I mean, who knows? If Sam Darnold keeps playing the way he has lately, yeah, that's not a great one. But again, just look at the numbers. This is what it says. But I think that also speaks to what we've already seen. None of these defenses really have great, easy schedules going forward. At least none of the defenses you want to play. There are some defenses like the Bengals and I think the Tampa Bay Bucks that have really good schedules. I don't want to play those defenses. I don't, because those teams just don't deliver what you need for fantasy upside. The Packers are kind of marginal. I guess a good enough defense with a pretty good schedule that makes them a top 10 defense here. They're 13th in sacks. They are 8th in terms of interceptions. They're 8th in terms of fantasy points scored and 9th in terms of points per game allowed. So they've been a little bit better than we really realize. At number 10, also a very fast improving defense that could get better if Marshawn Lattimore actually plays. It's the Washington Commanders. Now, if you've been on any of the live streams this entire week, you're asked a defensive question, or you heard somebody ask the best defense for week 15, well, I think it's the Baltimore Ravens, but a very close second is the Washington Commanders because they get the Saints without Derek Carr, which means we're either going to see more of Spencer Rattler or Jake Haener, and it doesn't really matter which one it is. Those are smash spots for the Washington Commanders either way, and I think they will smash. Now, week 16, it gets ugly against the Eagles. Really not a spot where you want to roll out the Commanders if you don't have to. But then in week 17, it's the Falcons, which all of a sudden looks very intriguing with the way Kirk Cousins is playing, not throwing a single touchdown with 8 interceptions over the past 4 games. If this continues, he really might not even be the starting quarterback by week 17. But if he still is, then that's definitely an intriguing upside matchup for this Commies defense. That said, I should warn you that the Commanders only have 4 interceptions on the entire season. Only the New York teams are lower. Yeah, both New York teams, the Jets and the Giants, only have 2 interceptions all year. At 11, let's go with the Arizona Cardinals. Just like the offense, this has been a very up and down team, a squad, unpredictable, right? They look great and then they don't. But they should be better because week 15 they get the Patriots, week 16 it's the Panthers, and then week 17 it's the Rams. Don't love that Rams matchup, but I really like the first 2. And if nothing else, this Cardinals defense hasn't really had any embarrassing moments. They're not a team that you feel like is going to give up 28 plus points and cause you to have a negative there. They're good enough to hold their own. They're kind of right there, top 12 in terms of points allowed, sacks, all of these statistical categories. So I like the schedule for the first 2 weeks enough. And believe it or not, even despite that Rams matchup, this ranks as the 7th best schedule for team defenses going forward. And then at number 12, let's throw a curveball in here. Look, you got to take some chances, right? It's the playoffs. Okay. You don't want to take too many chances, but if you are desperate, if you're deep, and none of these defenses are available, let's take a chance on the team that happens to have the easiest schedule. Yes, this is really the only reason I'm putting the Jacksonville Jaguars on this list. They have the number 1 best schedule going forward. Just listen. The Jets, the Raiders, and the Titans. Can you imagine the last 2 weeks having a defense that's going to face possibly Desmond Ridder and Will Levis? Now, this does require you to overlook the fact that the Jags are the bottom 5 in pretty much every single defensive category. But I will say, if there's a part of this Jags team that's still fighting and looking better, it's the defense. You know, they have Josh Hines, Allen, Trayvon Walker. They have guys who could get sacks. They just don't do it a lot. But lately, look, since they got completely demolished by the Lions in that one game, they held the Vikings to 12 points. They held the Titans to 6 points and won that game. They held the Texans to 23, which is not too bad. So let me say again, only if you don't have any of those other defenses and you're desperate and you just don't want to have to pick and choose every week and fight and whatever, you know, let's take a chance on this Jags team, maybe showing some pride to end the season. You make sure you got your lineup right from top to bottom. That includes every position, which we have you covered with. Every video that you need to win in week 15 is going to be in this week's playlist.